My name is Arthur Pendleton, and I am 52 years old. For the last 30 of those years, I've lived in the same two-story house on Sycamore Lane here in Maple Creek, Ohio. It's a quiet town, the kind of place where the biggest news is the high school football team's chances for the season or the quality of the pumpkins down at Miller's farm. My life has been as quiet as the town I live in. I was a history teacher at Maple Creek High for 28 years before I retired. I taught generations of kids about the rise and fall of empires, about the slow, grinding machinery of consequence. I always found a certain comfort in history, in the knowledge that actions, big and small, always have reactions. It's a principle as reliable as gravity. My house is my sanctuary, but the yard, that's something more. It was my late wife Alina's masterpiece. She had a gift for coaxing life from the Ohio soil. She planned every flower bed, every lilac bush, every winding stone path. She even chose the Japanese maple tree that stands as the centerpiece of the front lawn, its leaves turning a fiery, brilliant crimson every autumn. After I lost her 5 years ago, tending to that yard became my way of keeping her memory alive. I learned the names of all her flowers, the perennials and the annuals. I pruned the roses just how she liked them, and I made sure the lawn was cut in perfect, clean stripes. The yard wasn't just grass and plants to me. It was a living conversation I was still having with my wife. That peace, that quiet conversation, was shattered the day Frank Miller moved in next door. The house next to mine had been owned by the Hendersons, a lovely elderly couple who moved to Florida to be closer to their grandkids. The day the moving truck pulled up and Frank Miller stepped out, I felt a shift in the air on Sycamore Lane. He was a big man, loud in every sense of the word. His voice boomed, his truck roared, and his taste, I soon learned, was for all things shiny and new. He ran a chain of successful car detailing shops and carried himself with the swagger of a man who believed his money made him king of any hill he chose to stand on. His wife Brenda was just as loud, with a laugh that could curdle milk. They saw my quiet, established home and Alina's carefully curated garden not as something to be respected, but as something old and in the way. The problem started, as so many neighborly disputes do, with the falling of the leaves. Autumn in Maple Creek is a beautiful, messy affair. The great oak and maple trees that line our street shed their colors in a thick blanket, and every weekend is a symphony of rakes and leaf blowers. I always raked my leaves by hand. It was a slow, methodical process, a ritual. I'd rake them into neat piles, bag them, and leave them for the city pickup. It was quiet, respectful work. Frank, however, was a man of efficiency, or so he called it. He owned the biggest, loudest, most obnoxious leaf blower I had ever seen. It sounded like a jet engine preparing for takeoff. The first Saturday he fired it up, I was in my kitchen, drinking coffee and looking out at Alina's Japanese maple. Then the roar began, and a hurricane of leaves, dirt, and debris blasted across the property line, completely burying my pristine lawn in a bed of late-blooming mums under a thick, gritty layer of his yard waste. I told myself it was an accident. He was new to the neighborhood, maybe the wind just caught it. I spent the next 2 hours carefully raking his mess off my lawn, separating the debris from the leaves and retidying the flower bed. The next Saturday, it happened again. This time I was outside. I watched him. He pointed the nozzle of that mechanical monster directly at my yard, a smirk on his face, and let loose a torrent of leafy shrapnel. There was no mistaking it. This was deliberate. This was a statement. He was marking his territory, and he saw my yard as nothing more than his personal landfill. My quiet sanctuary was being violated, and a cold, slow-burning anger started to build in the pit of my stomach. The history teacher in me knew that this was an act of aggression, a border dispute in miniature. And I knew with absolute certainty that if I didn't address it, the incursions would only get worse. My first attempt at a solution was diplomatic. I was raised to believe that a quiet word between neighbors could solve most problems, so I waited until I saw Frank out by his mailbox a few days later. I walked over, forcing a polite, neighborly smile onto my face. "Good morning, Frank," I said, my voice calm and even. "I was hoping I could have a quick word with you about the yard work on the weekends." He leaned against his oversized pickup truck, crossing his arms. "Shoot, Art," he said, using a nickname I've always disliked. It felt like a small jab, a way of diminishing me right from the start. "It seems," I continued, choosing my words carefully, "that whenever you use your leaf blower, a significant amount of your leaves end up on my property. It's covering the flower beds in the lawn." I paused, hoping he would offer an apology and assurance it wouldn't happen again. Instead, he just laughed. It was a short, barking sound. "That's what wind does, Art. It blows. Can't control the wind, can we?" He winked, as if we were sharing a great joke. "It's not just the wind, Frank," I pressed, my patience thinning. "You're pointing the blower directly at my yard." He pushed himself off the truck and took a step closer, his bulk looming over me. "Look," he said, his voice losing its fake friendliness. "They're just leaves. They fall from the sky. Don't get your britches in a twist over a few leaves." He patted me hard on the shoulder and walked back into his house, leaving me standing there, feeling foolish and dismissed. My diplomatic mission had been a total failure. It hadn't just failed to solve the problem, it had made it clear that Frank was enjoying this. He knew exactly what he was doing, and my asking him to stop was just part of the fun for him. The next weekend, he was at it again, but this time it was worse. He made a show of it, revving the engine of his leaf blower and making long, sweeping passes along the property line, ensuring a thick brown tidal wave washed over my lawn. I felt my blood pressure rise. I decided on a different tactic, passive resistance, a silent protest. I spent my entire Saturday afternoon raking. I raked every single one of his leaves, along with my own, into dozens of large, brown paper yard bags. I then lined them up perfectly along the property line, a neat, silent wall of compliance. It was a clear visual statement. This is how a considerate neighbor behaves. This is what proper yard maintenance looks like. I thought surely he would see this and feel a flicker of shame. I was wrong. The next morning, I was woken by the roar of his blower. I looked out the window and saw Frank, a gleeful look on his face, blasting a fresh wave of leaves directly at my wall of bags, knocking several of them over and scattering their contents all over my driveway. He was not only ignoring my protest, he was mocking it. The conflict was escalating. It was no longer just about leaves. It was about respect, and he was determined to show me I deserved none. Over the next few weeks, Frank's campaign of petty harassment expanded. His two teenage sons started cutting across my lawn to get to their friend's house, leaving a muddy path through the grass a leaner had bobbied for years. Their basketball constantly bounced off my garage door. Loud music from their backyard parties would blast through my windows late into the night. Each incident was small enough on its own to seem trivial, but together they formed a pattern of deliberate, sustained disrespect. I felt a growing sense of helplessness. I called the non-emergency police line once about the music, and by the time an officer arrived an hour later, the party had wound down. Frank gave the officer a charming smile, apologized for the inconvenience, and then gave me a look from his porch that was pure venom. He had won again. My attempts to resolve the situation were only making me look like a cranky old man, and they were emboldening him. Low point, the moment my anger and frustration curdled into something much colder and darker, came on a crisp November afternoon. I was in the backyard pruning the rose bushes. There was one in particular, a peace rose that Alina and I had planted on our 25th anniversary. It was her favorite. Its blooms were a delicate blend of pale yellow and pink, and its fragrance filled the entire yard in the summer. It was more than a plant. It was a living monument to our marriage. As I was carefully snipping away the dead wood, I heard a crash from Frank's side of the fence. A moment later, a heavy-duty ladder he had propped carelessly against the fence slid down and slammed right into the peace rose, snapping its main, thickest stem completely in two. The largest part of the bush, the heart of it, was ruined. I stared at the splintered wood and the crushed leaves, and something inside me broke. I heard Frank and his son laughing on the other side of the fence. "Whoops," Frank boomed. "Guess that old thing was a bit brittle." He didn't apologize, he didn't offer to help, he didn't even acknowledge the damage beyond a casual, dismissive comment. He just laughed. I walked back into my house, my hands trembling. I sat in my armchair, the one facing the backyard, and looked at the mangled remains of Alina's rose. The leaves in the yard, the noise, the disrespect, it had all been leading to this. This was not just carelessness, it was a desecration. He had trespassed on my land, on my peace, and now he had trespassed on my memory of her. In that moment, sitting in the silence of my empty house, I felt a profound sense of loss, deeper than I had felt in years. It felt like all was lost. My quiet life was over, my sanctuary was breached, and my attempts to fight back had been pathetic failures. Frank Miller had won. He had trampled over everything I held dear and laughed while doing it. The history teacher in me knew that appeasement only encourages the aggressor. I had tried diplomacy, I had tried protest. Now there was only one option left, retaliation, and it would not be petty or passive, it would be historical. It would be a lesson in consequences that Frank Miller would never forget. A plan began to form in my mind, not born of rage, but of cold, calculated logic. As a history teacher, I'd always been fascinated by strategy, by generals who used their enemies' own strengths against them. Frank's strengths were his laziness, his pride in his superficial image, and his reliance on that monstrous leaf blower. I would use all three to bring about his downfall. My revenge would be poetic. It would be a mirror held up to his own behavior, magnified 100 times over. It required patience, preparation, and perfect timing. For the next 2 weeks, I became a quiet observer, a general gathering intelligence before a great battle. I noted Frank's routines. He did his major yard cleanup every other Saturday, always culminating in a self-satisfied survey of his perfectly leaf-free lawn. His biggest point of pride was the upcoming weekend, the one just before Thanksgiving. He was hosting a big pre-turkey bash for his employees and friends. He wanted his property to look immaculate, a testament to his success. That would be my day of reckoning. My preparation began in secret. I started collecting leaves, not just the ones Frank blew into my yard, but all of my leaves. Every crimson leaf from Alina's Japanese maple, every golden disc from the ginkgo tree, every brown curled leaf from the mighty oaks. I raked them into the back corner of my yard, hidden behind the garden shed, creating a massive, growing pile. But that wasn't enough. Under the cover of darkness, I began making trips around the neighborhood with my wheelbarrow. I collected the neatly bagged leaves my other, more considerate neighbors had left on their curbs for pickup. I quietly emptied bag after bag onto my growing mountain of foliage. I was stockpiling ammunition. My pile grew from a mound to a hill, a dense, multicolored mountain of autumn. Next, I made a trip to the hardware superstore in the next town over. I walked past the consumer-grade leaf blowers, the kind Frank owned. I went to the commercial section where the professional landscapers shopped. I purchased the most powerful backpack leaf blower they sold. It was called the Stihl BR800C, and the specifications read like a weapon of war. It produced an air velocity of over 230 miles per hour. It was described as having hurricane-force power. It was glorious overkill. The Saturday of Frank's party arrived. It was a perfect autumn day, cool and crisp. I watched from my window as his backyard filled with people. Frank was in his element, holding court by a massive stainless steel grill, a beer in one hand, tongs in the other. He was wearing a shirt that said Grill Master. He was the king in his castle. His lawn was perfect, a pristine green carpet. Around 2 in the afternoon, when the party was in full swing and his boss had just arrived, I knew it was time. I went into my garage and strapped on the BR800. It was heavy, like a soldier's pack. I did a few stretches just like I used to before a long lecture. I pulled the starter cord. The machine didn't just roar to life like Frank's, it erupted. The sound was a deep, throaty snarl that shook the windows of my house. It was a sound of immense, barely controlled power. Every head in Frank's backyard turned towards the noise. They saw me, a 52-year-old retired history teacher, standing on my lawn with a piece of industrial machinery strapped to my back. I gave them a calm, simple nod. Then I walked over to my leaf mountain. I aimed the nozzle and squeezed the trigger. A jet of pure force shot out, and a tidal wave of leaves, weeks of collected autumn, rose into the air. I didn't just blow them over the fence. I was a conductor orchestrating a symphony of chaos. I sent great, swirling clouds of red, yellow, and brown leaves high into the air, letting them rain down over his entire property. I systematically buried his perfect lawn, his manicured flower beds, his stone patio. Leaves swirled around his guests' ankles, then their knees. I sent a targeted blast towards the grill, extinguishing the flames in a flurry of dusty foliage and sending a plume of smoke and ash into Frank's shocked face. I filled his pristine swimming pool until its blue water was a murky brown soup of decaying leaves. His guests were coughing, shielding their faces, trying to pick leaves out of their drinks and food. The entire party had been consumed by a biblical plague of my design. Frank stood there, stunned, his mouth hanging open. Then his face turned a deep, furious red. He threw his tongs down and stormed towards the property line. "PENDLTON," he bellowed, his voice cracking with rage. "What in the hell do you think you're doing?" I shut off the machine, and the sudden silence was deafening. I calmly unstrapped the blower and set it down. I walked to the property line, stopping a respectable distance from where he stood fuming on his side. I looked him directly in the eye. My voice was not angry or loud. It was the calm, measured tone of a teacher explaining a fundamental concept. "I'm just returning your property, Frank," I said clearly so his stunned guests could hear. "For months now you've been misplacing it in my yard. I just gathered it all up for you. I believe the term for it is restitution. It's a historical principle. You give back what you've taken." I gestured with an open hand towards the apocalyptic scene in his backyard. "Every leaf you blew into my yard, every bit of disrespect, it's all back where it belongs. Consider it a lesson in cause and effect. Actions have consequences." Frank was speechless. He was completely and utterly defeated, not by force, but by the sheer, overwhelming absurdity of the situation. He had been publicly humiliated in front of his friends, his employees, and his boss. His image as the king of the neighborhood was shattered, buried under a mountain of his own preferred weapon, leaves. His guests began to make awkward excuses and leave, stepping through the thick carpet of foliage that now covered everything. Brenda herded their children inside, shooting me a look of pure hatred. The party was over. The war was won. In the following weeks, a new quiet settled over Sycamore Lane. Frank became a ghost. I'd see him skulking out to his truck in the mornings, never making eye contact. The sound of his leaf blower was replaced by the quiet, scratchy sound of a rake. He raked his leaves. He bagged them. He placed them neatly on his curb. The basketball was put away. The loud music stopped. He had learned his lesson. My sanctuary was restored. The peace I had fought for was sweeter because it was earned. I could once again sit and look at Aliner's garden, at her mangled but slowly recovering rose bush, and feel her presence without the constant, grating irritation of Frank Miller's existence. I had redrawn the border, and he would never cross it again. My new normal was much like my old normal, but with a deeper appreciation for the tranquility. One morning, a few months later, I was drinking my coffee when I saw a large moving truck pull up to Frank's house. A for sale sign had been quietly hammered into his lawn a week prior. I watched as Frank and Brenda loaded the last of their boxes, their movements quick and joyless. They were leaving Maple Creek. I won't lie, a small, satisfied smile touched my lips. I had not just won the battle, I had driven the invaders from my land. As their truck pulled away, a new car pulled into the driveway. The family who had bought the house, a man about my age, got out. He looked over at my yard, then at me on my porch. He gave me a big, friendly smile and a wave. I waved back, cautiously optimistic. Then he went to the back of his station wagon and opened the hatch. He pulled out a large, oddly shaped case. He opened it and carefully lifted out its contents. It was a set of bagpipes. He grinned, gave the bag a squeeze, and a loud, reedy skirl echoed across the quiet morning air. I took a slow sip of my coffee and leaned back in my chair. A new chapter was beginning on Sycamore Lane, and I, Arthur Pendleton, would be ready for it.